For those that may not know me, my name is Stephanie Charrington, and I am the Executive Director of the backbone of the Eastside Pathways Partnership. And the role of the backbone is to convene and facilitate, pull together data and communication on behalf of the partnership. And during this COVID-19 crisis time period, we've really shifted our work to support the broader community with these same sets of supports and services of convening and facilitating. And I have to mention, before I get too far into this, last week I talked about plumbing issues downstairs in our kitchen. And now I have to mention that we have a roof issue, and they happen to be here right now. So if you are hearing pounding, that's what that is, because they're doing it right now, and I apologize for that. Let's see, for the logistics of the meeting, I just want to mention, I invite everybody to unmute during this conversation, this convening. For those who might be on the phone, please remember that *6 is how you unmute on the phone. I also want to just mention that these are drop-in style meetings, and so feel free to make sure that you're inviting others to participate. Last Thursday, we took a poll that basically said ingesting this information via participation on these calls was the best way that you ingested information. Most of you said that. I do want to mention that these calls are recorded, and one of the most powerful action commitments that you could possibly make is to share the information or even share the recordings with those in your neighborhood, in your community, within your organization. So please know that these are all recorded, and the summary of the chat that gets very, very active is also made available by the end of the day. So feel free to share that out. Again, I want to invite those who may just have joined on to please put your name, your community or neighborhood or organization with which you're affiliated, and your contact information, because the contact information is also shared. If you are not wanting to be included in that roster, feel free to direct message Joe Trotty. Before I move on to the series purpose, I also want to just introduce the team really quickly here with the backbone. And facilitating today will be Kalika Curry. So Kalika, can you give a wave? She's one of our community impact managers. Also a community impact manager with the backbone is Sandy Nathan, one of our facilitators. Joe Trotty, I mentioned his name already, is our communications manager. Peyton Richardson is our data officer. And our business and operations manager is Vicki Yu, and Vicki is running all the things behind the scenes there. Vicki, give us a wave. There it is. All right. So the meeting purpose, we're now moving into what we're calling phase 3. So we started this about 6 weeks ago, and when we first started, it was very technical. It was to respond to a need of people who had immediate needs and people who had supports or services that could be offered, and making that connection. And then we moved into what we called phase 2, which was really, how are we moving to more equitable results? The immediate need, we were providing those supports and services, and then there's a realization of, you know what, there may be some people that we're missing. And how do we start to look at our work so that we get to more equitable results? And in this phase 3, we're really focusing on developing and strengthening community engagement so that we're better at serving all of those in our community. And part of this is sharing practices, tools, learning in public is a big part of this, and sometimes that's not always really comfortable for people to do. And part of this is how we're supporting each other in that growth and that learning. And an important element of that is strengthening relationships. So these are all elements that we're working to actually have as our results, to deliver as results in these weekly convenings. They were twice a week, but will be now moving forward every Tuesday at 10 a.m. So as we get into our gracious space here, we're going to do it a little bit differently than we have in the past. And I want to invite, I saw Cassandra on there already. I'm not sure if Paul Lawali is on, but I want to invite Paul and Cassandra to unmute themselves if they can. And what we're going to do is a fishbowl, which is, if you were at the meeting last Thursday, we did this activity. And the idea of a fishbowl is I'm inviting Paul and Cassandra, and I will tell you more about them in just a second, to really have coffee with me. And it's an opportunity for us to talk about some of the things that we're experiencing, and you get the opportunity to listen. So you're observing on the outside. So Paul and Cassandra and I are in the fishbowl, and you are hearing what we're talking about. And part of what we're going to be talking about is that learning in public, some of the discomfort that we might feel and how we overcome that. And you'll have the opportunity to hear multiple perspectives, and we will too with each other. So Paul and Cassandra, are you with me?
I'm here.
I'm here. Good morning.
Excellent. Hi, you guys. Thanks so much for being here. Paul, I'm not sure if you and Cassandra know each other, but Paul, Cassandra is a board member of the Lake Washington School District School Board. And Cassandra, Paul is the executive director or CEO of Friends of Youth. And so do you guys know each other by chance?
Eastside Human Services Forum. We both serve on the board.
Awesome. Okay, great. Super. Thanks for joining. I really appreciate it. I know for me personally, these times have been really, really challenging. So let me just ask you guys, how are you doing? How are things for you? And really, really, I want to know how you're doing, because relationships are so important. So tell me what's been going on with you guys.
Go ahead, Paul.
So how am I doing? I'm doing fantastic, and I think I can say fantastic just because I have my health, I have family, I have friends. I'm still doing the things that I love, and I think during this pandemic time just presented us with significant challenges, and not everybody can say the same. So I'm feeling fantastic just based on that. Now, lots of challenges as a mission-driven agency serving various communities. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm very blessed.
Nice, Paul. I love your positivity. It's so important in times like this. So I appreciate that. Cassandra, how about you?
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying, how are you doing?
Oh, okay. I would echo what Paul has said. I look at it as things can always be worse. And so what am I doing today that can make things better? And, you know, I cannot sit idly by. And to me, this group is that support system for me. And this whole situation has brought equity to the forefront. And I want to keep pushing it. We need to not ever lose the focus on equity right now that we have. And that feeds me.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. That's great. Thank you. So you mentioned about how coming to a group like this, Cassandra, feeds you, and we need to keep pushing it, so to speak. I love that. So for both of you guys, I want to pose the question and get your input on what inspires you to keep going when the answers aren't immediate. They're not right there and the path is unclear, especially in a time like this. How do you move through that?
Well, there's days where I pull my hair out literally, and I'm frustrated because I feel like I'm not doing enough. And then my family reminds me, every once in a while you have to take a break and take care of yourself, which I'm not the best at. So I have that constant feedback loop at home that you are doing a lot and you will never rest. You will keep on doing it, and it's okay to stop and take a break.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the respite, the opportunity to stop and reflect, that kind of downtime is really, really, really important. So say a little bit more, Cassandra, when you've had that time for respite and, you know, really taking care of yourself and you're ready to dive back into the work. And this work is hard. It's just plain and simple, just hard at times. When those answers aren't there, when you're diving back into it, what gets you unstuck, so to speak?
When I'm able to reach out to someone or some family or some group and have some kind of positive impact or step forward, that helps me to keep going on. I think for me, if I was to sit idly by, it would be, well, I would be depressed. Let's just put it that way. That wouldn't work for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I hear you saying is it's in the action where you get unstuck. You may not know the, 2 steps down the road, but you see something happening right now, and jumping in helps you keep moving forward. I think that's really insightful. I think, we've seen that a lot in our work. Even when we started these calls, it was, okay, we have these immediate needs right now. We need to jump in, and those still exist, right? The immediate needs are still there, and they're in front of us, and they're facing us every day. And sometimes it's hard to even just take the time to have a moment to say, how can we be doing this better? But to keep moving forward by action is really important. Thank you for sharing that. Paul, how about you? What inspires you to keep going when the answers aren't immediate?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's got their mantra or the thing they go to. So I think for me and the work that I've been doing not-for-profit work for about 20 something years, I think the calling has always been about how do you find those units of performance that add meaning to people's lives. And I think with the pandemic, it becomes critically clear that a lot of people are going to be vulnerable. A lot of people are going to, I guess, be the forgotten ones or disenfranchised folks. So how do you still try to do that if you are a mission-oriented agency trying to do good in the community? So I think that gets me up and going, remembering that's still the calling card for me, and really trying to look for other definitions of success. So what does success mean? I think you mentioned phase 2, really talking about who are those people we forgot, or equity, and what does success as far as equity look like in this new world that we're living in today. So for me, it's things like when we're inclusive and collaborative, when we're focused on the diversity in our communities, when we're responsive and adaptive, and I think adaptive would be the key thing. Never been stretched more than we have been stretched before. So there's a part of accountability and transparency and just trying to do what's just on a racial lens. So there's multiple layers to, how do you cope in this new pandemic? If I'm still trying to be true to finding those units of performance that add meaning to people's lives. And it is hard because you're working with limited, you're not having all the tools at your disposal that you typically have. But I think as most leaders all leaders who are on this call, it's still your job to provide environment for your teams. Still your job to make sure that they have the tools to do their job. And most importantly, especially in this world, that you provide them with the supports they need, whatever those may be.
Mm-hmm. I heard you mention, Paul, talk about those adaptive challenges and how, those are really challenging. Those are the problems for which there is no known solution, right?
That is true.
And in a time like this, when you're just trying to respond to the immediate needs that are in front of you, what is it that you do to step back, to allow for that space, like what Cassandra was talking about, to reflect on, okay, I know I have this immediate need in front of me, and I have to have the time and space to really think about these adaptive challenges. What is it that you do for that?
I think the first thing that I always go to, everybody's got the tricks of the trade, whether it's mapping, whether it's process, whether it's policy, looking at those, convening teams. So everyone's got their things that they typically do. But you did mention an adaptive challenge, and I think for me, I always say education, education, education. The better educated I am about something, the easier it is. You get enlightened. You just become enlightened. And once you're enlightened, you can have the elevated conversations. So I'm always trying to figure out, okay, what is it I don't know beyond my passions, beyond my training? What is it that I don't know about this weird situation that can actually help me get a little bit more enlightened? And if I'm more enlightened, then I can have these elevated conversations with internal circles, external circles. But at the end of it all, you're always trying to have some generative communication, and I think this is why I attend these meetings. Is this generative conversations or communication really stirs up reflective conversations that are geared towards connection and not disconnection. So we're all trying to connect to try and do something and birth something, so something comes out of it. So that feeds that educational piece, that feeds that enlightenment, and that feeds that enhanced conversations that I can have with anyone.
Mm-hmm. I love that, the connection and the relationships. That's why I started out asking, how are you guys really doing? Because those relationships are so important. Cassandra, I'm wondering if we have about maybe just a little bit, maybe 30 seconds or so. I'm wondering if you have anything to add that you actually do to make space to address those adaptive challenges.
So Paul made a good point about learning as much as you can. And for me, it is information overload, but I'm bringing it on myself because I want to know as much as possible, and then sifting through fact and maybe not fact, and trying to get an idea of opinions, trying to get that feedback from families and students and community members, and trying to look at multiple sources for that to get a bigger picture of the whole, so that going forward how you personally with your organization can make the most positive impact.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. That 10 minutes went by actually pretty fast. It always goes by faster than I think. So thanks, Cassandra. Thank you, Paul, for sharing. I really appreciate seeing you guys, having this coffee, this virtual coffee. And I actually encourage everybody on the call to do this occasionally. Reach out, look at that roster, reach out to other people and have these virtual coffees because they're meaningful. Okay, so now I want to switch this and allow everybody to have the opportunity to participate in Gracious Space. You will be transported by the power of Zoom into breakout rooms. You do not need to log off and log back on. The question that you will be exploring with each other, we can change slides here. I don't know if we're able to, but I can read the question here. Let me look at my other, there you go. Thank you. What inspires you to keep going when the answers aren't immediate and the path ahead is unclear? So Vicki, I am going to ask if you can transport everybody into their small group discussions. Folks are dropping back in. Welcome back from your breakout groups. As I was in the larger group, Vicki told me that you could really hear the pounding up above my head. So again, I apologize for that. And I'll try and keep myself on mute here in just a second. But I hope you all had an opportunity for a great discussion in your breakout groups. I want to invite just one or two quick input on how that was, any input on what inspires you. Anybody willing to share either in chat, if you're not willing to or don't feel comfortable unmuting, but anybody willing to unmute and share one or two things? This is our opportunity to learn in public together.
All right, I'll pop in. It's Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
Our group, I thought it was interesting. Basically, it was, if I could say, kind of one main theme was perspective, keeping perspective and looking at perspective, both in physical place, right? That it's not just us, it's around the world and other people have other issues besides COVID going on. Perspective in time, looking at what has been accomplished, as well as not just where we are, but keeping your eye focused on the future. And then perspectives in person, you know, who is it that we're representing, who's not at the table, how are we doing, how are others doing. So I think the perspective was really interesting, looking at it along a bunch of different dimensions.
That's great. Thank you, Joe. And Lynn, thank you for adding in the chat too. I'll just lift up witnessing the people around me and their amazing skill sets inspire. So thanks for adding that. And thanks again, Joe. All right, so as we continue, I invite you to continue to add comments or questions, or you can also do direct connections with folks in the chat. But for now, I want to turn it over to Peyton.
Thank you again, Stephanie, and thanks to my Gracious Space group, but also everyone for joining the call. We had a great Gracious Space conversation. You know, I wanted to this week to look at a little bit back at what we had covered last week around performance measures, but also really allow us to think about the data that you provided to us. So the statement here, from messy to measurable. Last week during our data section, we coined that term as we move from what is messy to what is measurable, and we kind of ground ourselves in data. And that's a little bit what we want to try and do today, is look at the pieces of data that you all have provided through surveys, and talk both about what that means to you. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to really dig into some of these pieces of data, and also how we as the backbone look at data and how that might influence moving forward, you know, as we continue to give the work back and move to results, what that might look like for you, for your organization, for all the programs and services that you are providing for your community. So we're going to talk about areas of focus, ways of ingesting information, and how we are working together. So the first, thanks Joe, we're going to go to the next slide. The first piece of information, again, this is us giving data back to you. You all, when we asked what topics would you like to cover, we see here that community engagement and data practices are kind of 1 and 2. But one of the things that we're really curious about, and I really want to invite you all to either unmute or take down some journal prompts or in the chat box, what do these topics really mean to you? You know, in the spirit of learning in public, we at the Backbone want to make sure that the offerings that we have and the direction that we're going is in line with exactly, you know, how you define each of these concepts. So just take a few minutes to think about, what do these, you know, any of these topics mean? Also, what do they look like? Specifically, community engagement, what does that look like? We're going to dig into that a little bit. And why, you know, community engagement or any of those topics, why are they important to you, to your organization, and how do you see them really moving the work forward, especially in this time? So I'm going to give us a few minutes to unmute or type in the chat box, and I may ask folks to speak on it, but I will make sure to lift up anything that I see that is extremely thought-provoking. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to really think about this.
Hey, Peyton, I just want to jump in really quickly. I love This is Stephanie, by the way. I forgot to say that for those on the phone. I wanted to emulate that practice. I love what Lynn put in the chat in terms of, wanting to see data that show actual need in the community. Lynn, I think that's an awesome, awesome point. And one of the things we are working to exemplify here is that practice of looking at our own data. And so this is data that we have as the backbone and the work that we do. And so hopefully this serves as a model for what folks who are doing in the community in terms of serving supports and services out there on this practice of looking at that data on a regular basis. So these are some of the reflection questions that we might be looking at, and just this is how we would show this kind of data and look at it. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Kalika, for lifting up Kalika's comment here. And did you want to unmute and talk a little bit about that, Kalika?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to Stephanie's point, the way I'm hearing these questions is really, as a backbone staff, we want to make sure we have shared understanding when you all are saying community engagement, adaptive leadership, and data practices are the things that you want us to center in this work. For me, it's really critical to understand that when I'm using the word community, I don't mean the people out there, the people over there, the people who don't work here. I mean all of these people that are within a geographical area that we're linking arms with to drive solutions. And I think quite often when I hear the word community, it's in the context of the other, not the people in this room, but those people outside there, outside of this building, outside of this room, outside of this conversation. And from a racial equity standpoint, I think what ends up happening is we minimize people and put them where they're not in a position of power to be working with us to drive solutions. So that's how I hold the word community, and I just wanted to share that with other folks because I think that's been really helpful in shifting my practice when I'm thinking about who do I invite into a conversation, and that really shifted it for me. Thank you, Peyton.
Thank you. All right, so these are areas to really allow the backbone really to understand what your shared understanding of these topics is. So I want to move us to the next piece of information. Again, this is data that we asked from you all about how you are ingesting this information. The reason that we really wanted to bring this up is for this reflection question: how, can you use this information to drive your own work? The backbone, we've talked about how to continually improve these calls, how to make sure that we are reaching the folks that we know are being impacted. How are we getting those resources, those pieces of information out, and how are we helping you all connect? So just again, take a few minutes to think about how can this, towering 93% of folks attending the calls in real time, how can you use that information to make sure that when you deliver services, when you deliver webinars or resource or pieces of information, looking at how you all want to be impacted and how you all want to be worked with, how can that help inform the modes in which you are allowing information to be given out from your organization? Just if anyone would like to, again, type in the chat or unmute, I'll give you a couple minutes before we move us on. So I will highlight Laura from Bellevue LifeSpring, who did type that. Some of the important topics that she sees are, again, charts and graphs, making sure that there is some sort of visual representation of where I need to, how it can be better addressed. And thank you, Laura, for typing in this about adaptive leadership. Making sure that you are able to do that deeper work, to kind of look beyond the technical and go into the deeper, more difficult to ask questions.
Hey, Peyton.
Yes.
I would just like to invite folks I know there's a lot of rich information, and we're kind of holding data as well as teaching a lot of concepts throughout this. So if folks have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or drop them in the chat. And I want to, if I could just pause this in, on that last slide when we were talking about definitions and how we're holding that information, if there are other folks who want some time to process that, please do feel to put that in the chat, and we'll make sure and address that in our large group conversation a little bit later in this call.
Thank you. I'm seeing more about extra presentations on data, looking at the needs and the gaps. Thank you for that. All right, so this is great. So I want to move us forward. So this is just a brief reminder. Last week we talked about the performance measures, the 2x2, looking at how well the difference made and how we are better off. And something that Paul said during the fishbowl really resonated with me. We're looking at units of performance to better people's lives, and I think that's a really unique way to put this. How are we, again, leading to that better off, that result statement? And so the reason we wanted to put this here is we as a backbone, again, want to learn in public and want to make sure that we have kind of continuous improvement. So those two graphs that you see are some of the data that we're tracking around attendance. And again, the top graph shows, as you can imagine, there are more people as the calls move on. One of the areas that we are working on is that bottom graph. So there are a lot of gray lines which have individual numbers, but that average of folks that are leaving the calls either right after the break, right after that kind of breakout session. So either they leave right before the breakout or after the breakout. And that's a really specific piece of information, but really this is the way that we are looking at data. We are looking at all of the pieces of knowledge that we can gather and wanting to create more equitable and better practices. So, how are we influencing participation by the model of the meetings, and how is the time being absorbed by everyone? So the reflection questions here are, how is time and capacity influencing your participation? Is large group or is small group more conducive for you to speak out and show up? And how is technology impacting your participation? Feel free to write that in the chat. But again, this is an example of how we at the backbone are really looking at how well are we doing, in order for this work to go forward. And as Paul said, in order for us to, better folks' lives, we really need to have a container that allows us to share resources and move towards results. And again, this is just one example of some of the data that we are using to make sure that these conversations, these calls, these convenings can be as effective as we, hope them to be. So I'm looking at, thank you again for kind of throwing in the chat a lot of really great points, especially about contextualizing data. I thank you, Helen. I think that's a really, really great point of understanding. Knowing that there are many data points, but many individuals do really face systemic barriers that may not be captured in by one data point or at all, and we really have to think about the different ways in which the system is impacting a lot of our different communities. So thank you very, very much for that. I'm going to move us along because we do have one final data prompt here. So we talked, earlier in the slides, about 3 slides ago, I talked a little bit about community engagement, how that was the top topic that you all really responded to. And, we're kind of learning in public, and we want to make sure that, as you kind of switch gears to kind of be a learner, how might you modify or improve, how you're engaging your community or consumers or your stakeholders or constituents? How might you do that? So I want to give you, we have about 5 minutes left here, time to think about or type in the chat box, like how might you modify or improve, how you're engaging with, your community or consumers. How do you think about that? Knowing that community engagement was one topic that, you know, rose to the top. What are each of you thinking about when you consider community engagement, and how might you change those practices? So I'll give you a few minutes here. So I want to invite anyone to share. Helena, thank you so much. I think that's really, really important about examining the systems that have been created to serve the community. You know, how can those systems change? And I think that one thing that I don't know, last week at some point, Sue Baugh did say that one of the things that has stuck with me is that we're, you know, making changes and we're thinking about things differently, but it's important that we continue to think about things differently and make changes, not just during this critical time, but actually carrying that through. And that, thank you for that, Sue, last week, and also that kind of carry through with what Helena has typed in there.
Peyton?
Yes.
I would like to share how we engage our audience.
Thank you, Liliana.
Okay, we at Padres Unidos, we have a database with about like 120 phone numbers, and we have their permission to send them information via text. So one of the things that we did for our workshop last night, we sent text messages to each of them with the link and the information, as well with the link to the campaign for the text messages that Lake Washington School District is working on right now. And we had a great response. And I just want to to tell you how is it. When we have in-person workshops, we can have like 15, 18 participants like coming to school. Last night, we got 27 participants. And after we did the workshop, like we recorded and we posted, and up to today in the morning, we had more than 100 views and many shares in our Facebook page. So we can tell that Facebook is actually a good way also to engage, but that direct contact, when you put your name and you say, hey, this is Liliana Medina from Padres Unidos, we want to invite you to do this, this, and this, people feel like a different connection. They feel it more personal, and our experience shows that they are able to respond like better. Hello?
Thank you. Oh, okay. I didn't want to cut you off. Thank you so much. I think that's really helpful to, you know, to hear you kind of talk through almost that 2x2 of how much you're doing, and then seeing how well it's working. And it seems like the numbers have increased in terms of the response and receiving that message, and hopefully those families that are now receiving that message can continue to be better off. So I thank you for pretty much walking us through kind of that 2x2 with what you said. Yeah, that is wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to move us along. I want to keep us on task here. So Vicky's going to throw up a poll, and we're going to talk a little bit. Well, I'll let the poll speak for itself. Just take about 5 minutes to just answer these questions briefly before we move it on to Kalika.
This is Kalika. I'm seeing these numbers coming in, and I'd love to hear from folks who've already completed while we're waiting for other folks. I'm kind of seeing some polarity around that stress question. I'm wanting to hear from folks who are saying they're very unstressed. What does that look like? Because I'm seeing more numbers at that higher end. So just really curious and wanting to get some narrative to support those numbers we're starting to see in the poll. There's no shame in being unstressed. Whoever reported that, I'd love to hear some story. Like,
okay, fine. I'll admit.
Okay,
admit.
thank you, Eric.
I was one of the very unstressed. Yeah, I'm just not real stressed about it. I think on an organizational level we are, but in my personal life I'm just not. So I don't know what you mean, like what it looks like. I'm kind of bummed. For family life and home and things like that. Just definitely a challenge having the kids at home all the time and them not being able to, go play at the playground or do a lot of the things that they normally do. So I think that if things were open, I would be taking my kids to do a lot of the normal things that our family normally does.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eric. So I'm hearing kind of you answering both around like, at home it looks like this, but at work it looks like that, and knowing that we're all playing a lot of different roles right now, and it impacts us in different ways in different areas in our lives.
Yeah, and I mean even within my household, my wife I think is definitely a lot more stressed about it. My kids don't. My son told me a story right before their school closed. They called it coronavirus tag, where the kids would chase each other on the playground and cough in the other kid's face, at which time the other kid's it. Like, they have no concept of their stress level. It's just like, okay, it's just completely different. So my kids don't really think about it at all. My wife is more stressed about it, and I think just kind of on the other end of that spectrum. I'm not that worried about it.
Yeah, thank you. That's another really great perspective. I heard on a call last week with Courageous Conversations, a Asian woman had shared that her daughter during the last week of school was spit on because she's Asian looking. And so just hearing, I want to share that narrative, not to be a Debbie Downer, but just really, as you're talking about like kids versus adults and the different roles we're holding, then also racializing that to say that that's another area where a lot of different people are experiencing this differently, and then also kids not having the understanding of the consequences of that behavior. So something as playful as coughing, and then all the way extreme to a racially charged incident, even and with children at elementary school age. So I think it's important for us to lift up, just everybody experiences this time very differently. Looks like we're almost there. So Peyton, I'll leave it to you to when you want to close that out. Thank you, Eric.
We are getting close. I'll give it 30 more seconds, and then I know we should move on. Folks may be on the phone or not want to participate. That's okay.
So full disclosure, I had to leave for a few minutes. I wasn't really sure what the topic is, but I did take the test, the little poll that you guys sent out.
Okay.
So I know we've only got 30 seconds left, I think, before this segment ends, but I'm happy to chime in if you can refresh me on the question.
Yeah, I was framing that I saw some polarity in having just a few people report that they weren't very stressed, and then seeing more people ruminating around the higher levels of stress. So I invited just a person to kind of speak to what that looks like, just because I was seeing such a small number of people reporting. And so asked Sergeant Karp spoke to his experiences as someone who reported that. And then that third question there in community engagement is really going to inform the our conversation here moving forward. And just because I know you all can't see them, I'm seeing 34% of you are saying that they strongly agree that community engagement, data informs community engagement strategies. The high point is 37% of you are saying that somewhat agree that data informs community engagement, and then it kind of weans down from there. And those aren't hard numbers. Peyton can give us like the actuals, but just what I'm seeing in a preview. Yeah, Tammy.
So I'm reading what Helen is writing in the chat as far as in school, and it brought me right back to right before school ended. I don't know how many of you know I'm also a Bellevue School District teacher. And I have a diverse class, and one of the games that was played right before they closed was, do you have the coronavirus? And it went around recess time. And while it did become very racially charged, and we did address it right away, we're talking about 7-year-olds, and it's so hard. I became stressed at that moment, and my stress level has not gone down at all. Mm-hmm. With the things that I saw right before school closed and where we are now. So I do want to say that, yeah, that it was something that was in the schools before they even closed.
Yeah.
So Helen, yes, I do agree with you on this.
Thank you for sharing your story, Tammy. Peyton, are we closed on it? Okay, awesome. So thank you, Peyton, for all of that data. I'm going to carry us through into this next section. Really wanted to just take pause and kind of talk about the tools that we're using, because while we're on these calls, a big part of the value that we've all continued to talk about is being able to leverage each other's expertise. And then, sorry, I got to pop up here. Leverage the expertise of the folks on this calls, hearing how we're innovating. But another powerful part of these, as Tammy just modeled, is sharing our stories so that we can really start to understand what's going on in our community and be developing solutions to help respond and hopefully prevent some of those things happening. And then as we continue to talk about this idea of moving from messy to measurable, is on that 2x2, the bottom right really is what keeps us coming to these calls. Stephanie in our fishbowl with our two guests here today really talked about times right now we're unclear. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know what this looks like. This is unprecedented. And so we're leaning into data to, one, help us have a shared vision for why are we getting on these calls. We have a shared vision to support our community and make sure everybody has what they need to survive during this time. Moving into that bottom left, the blue one, the difference made is really just, what are we all going to do together? What are the strategies? How are we going to ensure that at the end of this, everybody's needs were met? And then the top right, that yellow, is really thinking about what are the early warning signs. By jumping on this call, that's us putting our time, effort, energy, and expertise into slowly moving towards that desired state. And then that top left is where folks were starting to say, we need those numbers. We need to know what's really happening. What are the outputs and outcomes? So those are those data practices. That fishbowl conversation that Stephanie hosted with our guests this morning is a really great vehicle when doing community organizing, especially on virtual calls. It's so hard to go really deep when you have a lot of people on, but leveraging the relationships that you have with someone saying, will you be courageous and speak your truth in front of other people to help us all go that deep? And then being able to hear stories like Tammy just shared around, here's something that really moved me, and here's something that I'm still holding. Last Thursday, we did a fishbowl that with our Racial Equity Council on talking about racial equity as a practice, as a value, as a lived experience, and recognizing it can't be an add-on, it can't be an afterthought, but yet it has to be a lens that we're always looking at things through while we're diagnosing and developing solutions. And then the other piece that you all reported in our poll was also talking about adaptive leadership. This idea of You know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And in order to discover the unknown, you have to gather multiple perspectives. You have to link arms with community. You have to link arms with the people that you want to impact and affect. And really, the longer you can stay and sustain yourself in that unknown is the deeper you can go to really start discovering and innovating. And that was that discomfort that Stephanie was talking to this morning. Lastly, today we want to introduce a new methodology or way of thinking, this concept around targeted universalism. We're going to do something a little bit new here on the call today, which is going to be sharing a 3.5 minute video with you all. If you come to some of our institutes, we have shared this video before, but this video is really powerful because it gets to the heart of what you all have been talking about on these calls. We know that one size does not fit all. We really have to understand who we're trying to serve, take what we do well, and then refine that. So when Peyton earlier was talking about how do you show up in these spaces? Are you someone who talks in small group? Are you someone who shares in large group? That's an area, for example, where the backbone is thinking about, okay, we hop on these calls and we just think everybody's going to talk in the large space. That's not true. So we have small breakout sessions because we know that's better suited for some people. So this idea of we convene people, but we also know that we need to think about the people that are in these spaces. Know that when we're designing these meetings, we think about each and every one of you and think about what's going to best serve you. And that's that idea of targeted universalism. So we're going to play this video really quickly. Please stay engaged. I know it seems kind of odd to be watching a video together, but I hope that it helps us kind of develop some shared understanding. So Vicky's going to play that video for us, and I'll be right back. I think can folks hear it? I can't hear it yet.
No.
Okay, thank you. Again, learning in public, right? Trying a new tool.
All right, it's actually Joe, not Vicky. Let me try that.
Vicky's like, you better tell him it's not me.
Hey, it worked in rehearsal.
Okay.
Stand by.
Thank you, Joe. Has anybody seen this video before on targeted universalism? No, I'm seeing some heads.
This is Sue. I've seen it.
Yeah, we know you've seen it, Sue.
I got it memorized.
There it is. Thanks, Joe.
What is the most effective and sustainable policy response to problems in our society? Universal approaches are widely used in order to package policies for broad appeal. Universal policies such as Social Security and minimum wage provide the same benefits or minimum protections to everyone, regardless of status or group membership. But by treating everyone the same, universal approaches can't root out group-based discrimination and may actually deepen inequality between groups rather than reduce it. And by providing benefits or protections to everyone, resources that could be targeted to groups worse off instead flow to those who are better off. In contrast to universalism, targeted approaches are commonly used. Targeted policies provide benefits or protections based on group membership or status. SNAP, the food stamp program, conditions benefits on income level. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accessibility for disabled groups. And affirmative action focuses on historically disadvantaged groups. Targeted approaches are vulnerable to the critique that they unfairly favor constituent groups over the public good by directing resources to marginalized groups who are already subjected to unfair stereotypes. But universal and targeted approaches are false choices. There is a third way, targeted universalism. Targeted universalism means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. This approach targets the various needs of each group while reminding us that we are all part of the same social fabric. This can be accomplished by following 5 steps. First, set a universal goal. For example, 100% proficiency in 8th grade math. Second, measure how the overall population fares relative to the universal goal. In this example, we might discover that only 80% of 8th graders are proficient in 8th grade math. Third, measure the performance of population segments relative to the universal goal. So although 80% of all 8th graders are proficient, we might find that only 70% of Latinx students are proficient. Fourth, understand how structures and other factors support or impede groups' progress toward the universal goal. For our Latinx students, classroom instruction materials and lessons designed for English speakers may impede learning, including math proficiency. Finally, implement targeted strategies so that each and every group can achieve the universal goal based upon their needs and circumstances. This may take the form of ESL-specific math tutoring for our Latinx students, while another group may require a completely different strategy to achieve the same universal goal. Targeted universalism rejects a blanket universal, which may be indifferent to the reality that different groups are situated differently relative to the institutions and resources of society. By aspiring toward shared universal goals, targeted universalism empowers targeted strategies capable of achieving those goals while moving us beyond concerns over disparities alone and toward our highest aspirations for all.
All right. Thank you so much for sticking in with me. I know when they drop that line about targeted universalism, I always have a chuckle because it just seems so simple. But we know to move to action and really do that is not so simple. That's where the complex work happens. So just wanting to invite a few folks to share their thoughts on that concept, whether in the chat box or by unmuting yourself. Also want to introduce on that ribbon, there's a reactions option. And so if you're someone who, might be a little bit leery of jumping in, if you raise your hand, it will notify me and I can call on you if that makes things easier for you to jump in here as well. I know sometimes it can be awkward with this number of people on the call to jump in here. But just want to hear from a few folks on what your thoughts are, and also inviting people to maybe share some examples of modifications that you've made to reach new groups in the programs and services that you're offering, or even modifications you've made to serve them more effectively. Another question I'd like to offer, again, reaching back to that adaptive leadership skill set, is thinking about what are the tools and practice that allow you to diagnose and develop those solutions that you've made. So I'm going to pause there and create some space for folks to share. I happen to know a lot of the great work people are doing, so I'm happy to call on you.
I'm going to volunteer myself.
Thank you, Cassandra.
So when we first started serving meals to students, as soon as possible after school's closing, we started with all of our middle schools, and then we realized, no, we need more locations. Then we went to middle schools and some elementary schools, and then we realized we're not reaching certain areas. So then the food moved to certain apartment complexes, so that all the families had to do was come to the parking lot and receive their free meals. That's just one example of how we have to keep and will continue to keep adjusting to what the needs are.
Thank you. That's a great example. Thank you. I think the first time I ever really understood what this meant was an article I read in the Adaptive Leadership Program on curb cuts, where in the sidewalk, the curb is cut out, and talked about how hard folks with disabilities had to work to get the city to do that. I'm not pointing finger at any particular city, but just to get that shared value and shared understanding of the impact of not having that curb cut for people who needed it in wheelchairs, and all the hard work that it got to get those policies changed. But now that they're there, moms with strollers, kids on scooters, people on new scooters, it actually ends up benefiting everybody, but it took one group who needed it the most and them staying focused and committed to change those policies. And that was the first example where I really got this concept, and I've held that with me ever since, thinking sometimes just one person needs it and we don't really understand why they need it, but once we yield to that and support them in getting their needs met, we often end up benefiting from it as well. I'll invite some more folks to talk about some of the modifications that they're making. I know Liliana and Alma, you both have spoken richly about a lot of the ways that you guys are helping work and navigate through the system and help get your communities connected. Always appreciated those examples. I know we've got a lot of folks from some of our early learning groups on here as well. So I know we've got a lot of great examples on the call.
Can I, Kalika?
Yeah, Tammy.
So Liliana and I have connected offline out of these meetings, and she did something for both Lake Washington and Bellevue School District about meal availability and put it on her Facebook page. And I just let her know that I am working very hard to get the Bellevue Nourishing Network's Facebook page up and running so that I can link them, so that I can possibly, you know, spread the word in Spanish. So that's what I'm doing. And I know that that wasn't eloquent. Sorry.
That was great.
But that's what we're trying to do. Is I reached out personally to Liliana.
Thank you. So I'm hearing you really modeling this idea of leveraging the relationships on this calls, mutually reinforcing activities, seeing that small test of change, right? So here, Liliana and Alma and Padres and Udis have done the work to do all those small tests of change. They've shown us how effective that is. And for us to be able to adopt those practices and jump on that bandwagon, I think that's a great example of how one of the benefits of being on these calls is each of us can really do what we do best in our lanes, and then the rest of us can go, that looks great, we should do that too. So I really appreciate you being transparent and sharing that example. I also see Ward. I want to invite Ward to speak to what you've dropped here in the chat, if you don't mind. I know he's on here unless he's dropped off.
Hey, Kalika, I don't see him on unless he's on the phone.
Okay.
He may have had to drop off.
I can share, and I'll invite Paul. Paul and I had the pleasure of working together for the YMCA for some time. One of my favorite bosses. He's not paying me to say that. No shade, Stephanie. That's actually how I got connected to Eastside Pathways, was their relationship, and really thankful for both of them for stewarding my career and inviting me into this space. But I want to reference some work at the Y. One of the first things I saw that the Y did that was a huge change was the application for financial assistance. There was a lot of work that was done, and I know Paul can speak to really understanding how the Y had a value for making sure everybody could have access to those memberships, but realizing the process in and of itself was inequitable and created barriers. Paul, do you want to speak to kind of that process?
What I'm going to do is I know Nicole's on the phone, so if Nicole wants to speak, because she's still at the Y, we were out of the Y. So if Nicole's there, fine. If not, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Nicole, are you there?
I'll check.
Hey, I'm here. I would just say that I haven't been a part of that financial assistance piece since I don't have a branch, unfortunately.
Hey, Paul, this is Heather with Bellevue.
Oh,
Heather can definitely.
The whole
yeah.
family on here.
Yeah, I'm with the Bellevue Family Y, and the process that we saw was like the paperwork people were bringing in, like just to try to prove like what their income was. It really was like creating a lot of barriers for people. So we actually have also done some different adjustments with the process, but ultimately people have to. I will just come in and identify what is their income availability and what they make, and we take their word for it, and they don't have to prove anything, provide any tax returns or anything like that, because again, that is creating a barrier for people even wanting to consider a membership. So even after, if someone says that they cannot afford a certain income level of membership, we try to talk with them even further to see what is it that we can work with you to make a membership possible.
Yeah, thank you. I want to also lift up another tool in this moment, BART. If you haven't heard us talk about BART, this was a really great example of it. So BART is a boundary of authority, role, and task. And you can kind of see how, you know, Paul said, hey, I don't work there anymore. That's not my BART. That's not my role. I'm no longer employee. And I'm saying, it's not mine. I work for Eastside Pathways. And then Paul and I are both like, okay, someone else does. And it is Heather's BART, right? She's still a representative of that organization. She's owning that body of work. So another tool that we often think about is who's the right person to drive this work? I might have some information because I used to work there, but my information's is kind of stale. I can't actually drive those solutions. So I really enjoyed watching that happen as we're all quickly looking for someone. And this is exactly what happens when we try to move to action, is who is the right person to drive that? It wasn't me, it wasn't Paul, and Nicole's there, but it's not her department. Thankfully, Heather was on the call and she could pick that up, that work, and drive it for us. So thank you for modeling that in real time. You really do have to have the right BART, the right authority, the right roles in order to move those tasks forward. So thank you all for processing this with me. I'm going to move us, start to transition us out, but my hope is that we're always not only sharing roles and resources and our shared lived experience on these calls, but that we can also provide some teaching tools, because doing adaptive work is really messy, and there's so many different ways that you can slice up this work. Last week we talked a lot about data and how influential it is in really helping to chunk out and make sure we know when we're making progress, because sometimes it's really hard to tell, right? I think I've shared before, I've had conversations with my dad where he says, I hope things would look different, and he had all these moments along the way that led him to believe that things would look differently. But it's those small moments in between that really help us understand if we're heading in that right direction, if we're heading towards the vision that we have. And a part of that is taking mutually reinforcing actions or activities. On the slide you'll see right now, these are those, if you're not familiar, Eastside Pathways is a collective impact organization, and those 5 circles are the pillars at which we drive this work around. We've been working a lot about shared performance measures and using data, not just the quantitative, but the qualitative, the stories that we're all sharing with each other, what we're seeing in real time, from the top all the way to frontline staff. Today, we really wanted to start to think about what are those mutually reinforcing activities. Tammy shared a great example of that. I heard the great work that Alma was doing and Nisa and Padres Anudas is doing, and I'm jumping on that. I'm taking some time to make those modifications so that we can align to that activity. So as we continue to convene on these calls, you'll see that we're going to continue to tackle each of these pillars and continue to offer you tools and resources and moments to think together collectively about what that looks like. So just to reinforce today, we talked about data practices, using a data walk, giving you back the data that you gave us and taking time to think about that with you so we make sure we're all holding that information in the same way. When I gave that example of community, I know that that may not be the way that community is defined for you. And the relationships is taking the time to make sure you have a shared understanding of things. So when we go to action, we're on the same page around what that really means. I know on these calls, a lot of people, when we're thinking about community engagement, have been thinking about an organizational level. This organization is working with this organization. And for some of us, that might mean this community of people within a certain neighborhood are working with the block next door. So how we're holding this language really does determine how we take action together today. So again, multiple perspectives, leveraging, making sure that you're talking to people who have different lived experience than you. Those small tests of change, especially as things are so ambiguous and unknown for us right now, is starting small, measuring the changes that we're making and seeing if it's tracking in the direction that we want to go into. And then ultimately, like I just talked about, that BART, boundary with the role and task, leveraging the relationships, roles, and resources on these calls. If I don't have the authority to drive that change, I'm not the right person for it. And we got to model that for you today. Before I pass things out for Stephanie, I'd love to hear from a couple of folks on the call around what you might do differently. What action can you take between this meeting and the next? Stephanie mentioned earlier that this is the beginning of us meeting once a week. So as we do start to decrease the time that we spend virtually with one another, we really hope you're protecting this time to continue to think adaptively, to continue to diagnose and develop solutions through that racial equity lens, and to continue to increase how much time you're spending in that community engagement pathway so that you're really being able to leverage the perspectives of the people that you're trying to serve. So wanting to invite a couple people to share what actions will you take between now and our next meeting. And I did have a couple people ask me. I will make sure that the BART, Boundary of Authority, Role, and Task document is in your Google Doc Drive. So if you haven't already, it's a great opportunity to check all of the recordings as well as any of the models and documents that we're sharing with you on these calls. We do upload them into the Google Drive that you can download and you utilize at any time. Thank you. So I'm seeing some people check in the chat box around continue to drive the work that they're doing. Also hearing some folks make some commitments as it relates to what they heard on this call. Kathy earlier lifted up a question around, are they surveying the people that they're providing services to really understand what that experience looks and feels like, and seeing Colleen, for example, making a commitment to go drive that work and see what that looks like for them to be able to deliver that practice. Tammy making a commitment to have a Zoom meeting. Awesome, thank you. So I just really want to enforce, even for folks who aren't sharing vocally or in the chat box, that it's those small action steps, even if it's taking some time after this call to journal all the things that we've talked about. We know we're throwing a lot of tools and concepts at you, really wanting to encourage you to take those small tests of change for yourself, to reflect, to ingest a lot of these tools, to reach out and collaborate with people on these calls, or if you're ready to go back and drive those changes in your practices, either in your community or your organization. Thank you for allowing me to facilitate, and I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie to close us out.
Thanks, Kalika. So I just wanted to, before I get to this last little quote here, I just wanted to reinforce again, we know that how we work together influences the systems that are within our community and that are our community. And so this whole focus of how we're working together, we know will impact those services, those supports that actually get to children, youth, adults, families in our community. And so that's why this focus of coming together, first of all, checking in on how we're doing personally is really important. The number of times we've heard relationships are key on these calls is super important, and an important element of those relationships is really checking in with each other on how we're doing. The second is this learning in public, and being able to sit in the discomfort sometimes when we don't know the answers and the path is unclear, and how we're supporting each other when we're learning in public. And then the third is, how are we taking action, as Kalika just talked about. It's, again, the small little actions. I mentioned at the outset of this, one really powerful action commitment is sharing the recording of this call with those who may not have been able to be on the call. If you are in your neighborhood or your community or organization, share this recording and just say, hey, there's some powerful tools on here that may be helpful for you, for us to work on together. So that is a really, really powerful action commitment. Having conversations with others who are within your spheres of influence, asking questions of, I'm stuck here, what do you guys think? Those are all action commitments that when we take those small steps together, we start to move the system and change and influence how we work with each other so that we can get better outcomes for the members in our community who we're trying to serve. So really, really appreciate you all being here, being willing to learn together. Look at these tools that we're providing. We're trying to exemplify for ourselves in the backbone how we're using the tools, and in those examples, hopefully it might inspire you to be able to use those tools in your neighborhood or organizations. So we actually shared this quote last Thursday, and we made a little bit of a tweak. This is our example of learning in public. So it says right now, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed community members can change the world. Last week it said citizens, and we want to emphasize community members that can change the world Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So it's our work together, how we are being able to be open to modifying and tweaking our own current work so that we get better, so that we can get better outcomes for those that we serve. So thank you for being here. And in closing, I would like to open it up for folks to offer one word or phrase that describes your experience in these meetings. Feel free to unmute. One word.
Inspired.
Thank you, Alma. Inspired. I love it. Couple more.
Hopeful.
Hopeful. Thank you, Sue.
Empowered.
Empowered. Let's close on that one. Let's feel empowered to take action in any way whatsoever we deem appropriate between now and next Tuesday. And we'll see you next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Until then, be well, everybody.